could be together this evening. I'm going to look at a few statements from the book of James, chapter 1, where in light of so much sadness, loss, and disaster, certainly it brings our mind to what God's Word speaks to us about trying to make sense, if at all possible, when we're left wondering why things unraveled the way that they did, how you can move forward, how we can continue on with life itself at times. And James addresses the practical side of just that struggle that we go through. Obviously, if we are blessed to know the gospel of Jesus Christ and be liberated and freed and forgiven of our sins, we are given this great sense of elated hope and confidence, but also we realize we're still living in the limitations of this present life, and we get bombarded with our day-to-day routine, as we talked about here this morning, and obviously the disasters that unfold before us. And we can often be left just wondering just what to make of all these things. And James encourages us to realize that it's in those moments that God does have some answers for us if we will accept them. God does have things that he can teach us in those moments. And he says in James chapter 1, verse 2, he says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." James encourages us to actually, this is the appropriate time, if any time, to cleave and to draw even closer to the Lord. And he says he promises he will give us wisdom. He will bless us with a sense of trying to strike a balance with making some kind of sense with what to do now or how to continue going on when we just wonder how in the world can I muster up enough energy to face another day when this day has just been an absolute disaster, and yet I'm left with the days ahead to clean up the aftermath, to have some sense of ability to move on, to press forward. And it truly is challenging for us in any shape or imagination, where James tells us there is a sense of comfort. I believe that's the joy he's speaking of. He's not speaking certainly not of any happiness whatsoever. When you're in tragedy, you're in a state of sadness, you're in a state of loss, you're in a state of discomfort. But there is a sense of, I believe, that joy is that sense of peace. There is a sense that God can comfort us and give us some sense of confidence that allows us to move forward, to continue on as we still are scarred by tragedy, still have the markings left of everything that we've gone through, and those things sometimes take years and years to heal, if they ever heal at all. And we need to recognize that God does not promise us that he will ever shield us from, obviously, those deep wounds and scars that many of us will face and carry with us the rest of our lives. But he does promise us that he loves us and that he cares for us, and he wants us to draw even that much closer to him, and he assures us he will provide us what is necessary to pick ourselves up. How can we continue to move forward? I mean, this is the wisdom he's speaking of, and it goes back really to some of the works of wisdom, words of wisdom that we were given in the books of Old Testament wisdom, where it speaks very frankly, saying it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, because the living take it to heart. We realize that there is the end. There is going to be an end for all of us. And we need to take it to heart so that we can learn some pieces of wisdom that God has for us, that maybe some things maybe we haven't been focusing on, that we can realign ourselves and refocus to have some sense of strength, peace, contentment to move forward. We just want to look at 3 areas of wisdom that I believe God is willing to give to us if we seek Him, if we ask for it. One of the pieces of wisdom that God has for us, that He promises, that He assures us we can have, is there is a sense when we are going through tragic loss and tragedy around us, there is a sense where wisdom teaches us to remind ourselves that God does have a place of permanence, a place of permanent rest, a place of permanent comfort, a place where despite whatever tragedies or horrific experiences we ever are forced to go through this life and forced to carry with us the pain and the memory of loss, the memory of wonderful days that tragically came to a dark, dark end, God assures us that if we continue to cleave to Him and seek His guidance and His truth, that He promises us this is but a temporary experience and assures us that we can even cling even stronger to a place of permanent rest. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he speaks of this permanent rest. A place where despite whatever temporary loss we ever go through, and tragically at times we have to go through enormous amount of loss, and many are experiencing that, and sadly it's not going to end until the earth ends. Many will still have days, unfortunately, where unthinkable events will unfold. We have no clue to what extent, but rest assured they're coming. Jesus Himself laid this statistic: there's going to be wars, there's going to be famines, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be all kinds of unthinkable disasters. But there will come an end. And he speaks of this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in verse 1. He says, "For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." I believe if we are all honest with ourselves, we could probably come to some recognition, some honest place of examination, where if we are truly honest, we recognize we probably from time to time spend a bit too much time engaged in these temporary dwelling places, the things He provide for us, the temporary pleasures we get from just the kind of life we're building for ourselves here. It is too easy for us to get so attached, and that's been a blessing for us as we're talking about attitudes, Christian attitudes. We're talking about that. If you haven't been able to be with us in the Sunday morning, it's a great discussion, a great time to examine this very thought. We're discussing that idea of how the Christian often gets in a tug of war and often loses that battle with our attachment to these things. If we're honest with ourselves, especially when tragedy rips these things away, we sense this great deal of loss, and that loss is coming from a place where we want to build a permanent place for these things to remain. It's really our nature. God Himself has said He's placed eternity in our hearts. We are built hardwired with the design to want to have kind of a permanent nesting place for us, for our things, for our possessions, for our livelihood. It's in us to want to have a place where we can kind of rest up and protect it and keep it there forever. The problem is that God wants us to long for it. It's just not here. We obviously have a responsibility to build a life for us, to be useful, to be productive, to provide for our families. But we also have this challenge to stay true to a spiritual desire that clings to the permanent places of God which are yet to come. And in those moments when we're feeling that loss, when we're feeling that pain, perhaps that's a moment of wisdom to ask God for strength, ask God for help, and be honest and confessional. Lord, I perhaps am building too much of an attachment. So much that it's so easy for me that it's almost unthinkable to think, how can I move past this? How can I move on? And that's a natural experience, that's a natural response, but yet one that opens up the obvious wounds we have of our struggle to walk by faith. And God is there wanting to help us, and he wants to help us, namely with this piece of wisdom, to remind us, saying, I recognize how painful and how difficult it's going to be to move past this, but he says, but consider this. Consider that even if it is taken away, even if it falls down, isn't it a great blessing if you are a child of God? If you have built your life rested on these promises, that there is an eternal place where you can have that same sense of permanence and that same sense of attachment only. It will never be taken away. Will never be destroyed. That's the thought he gives us there in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Let's continue reading the thought. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, he says, for we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Jesus had a moment where he dealt with a man with this honest problem. He dealt with a man who was very honest in how he assessed his life. Naturally, I think we all probably relate in some way or degree to the man who was building up barns. We may say, well, I can't relate to that. I don't even have a barn, let alone many barns to store up all of my goods. But I think we can relate to his purpose. What was his purpose? His purpose was, I want to get to that place where I don't have to worry. I think if we're honest with ourselves, that's what we're working for. That's why we put in the extra hours. That's why we go through that place. We maybe say, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I don't want to go back into the office again, but we do it. Not only, yes, there's a necessity to do that, but also there's that yearning that if I continue doing these things, perhaps there's going to get to that place where I don't have to worry as much. Now remember, God has placed that in us. He wants us to, yes, have that sense of longing for it. The problem is where we put it. Where we put it. We get easily distracted. Well, this man put all that longing in this temporary life. Now, this man was not necessarily sinning by having great possessions. No, I don't believe that for a second. He was not sinning by having practical wisdom of saying, well, obviously I need a place to store them. The problem was, he miscalculated. He miscalculated how much time he had to enjoy them. He thought, I have plenty of time to get to that spot. And when I do, it's going to be blissful. This man needed wisdom, did he not? In fact, what did Jesus call him? He said, thou fool. This very night, your soul will be required of you, and who shall inherit these things? That's what he miscalculated. He miscalculated thinking, assuming, I have plenty of time. And that's the part that confuses us, that robs us, that misleads us. We have this sense of wanting to get to that place, and we convince ourselves we have plenty of time to experience that here and now, right now, and we continue to work and build and invest so much in it that, again, we miscalculate. James chapter 4 continues with this thought of wisdom. I believe this is what James was pointing to, a piece of wisdom that God can give us. It may not be often what we want to hear, but it is what we need to hear. With every day we have of investing and looking for that place of rest, that place where I don't have to worry as much, here's what he says that we ought to have tucked away in a point of wisdom. James chapter 4 verse 13 says, come now you who say today or tomorrow We will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. If we're honest with ourselves, most of us, even though we've been told this, we've thought it, we perhaps even said it, really miscalculate how much of a vapor that is. It's a miscalculation of time. Wisdom says, do you even realize how short of a blip of your existence actually is? Even if you should have said X amount of time extra in this life, in the vast scheme of things, it is seriously just in an instant, it's there and it's gone. And we recognize this, especially in moments of tragedy, how in our minds we can see, I'll probably have plenty more time to enjoy my family, plenty more time to enjoy the blessings that my life has provided me with. Job, I don't believe Job had any thought that when he spoke to his children, perhaps visited with his children, had any thought one day that was the last time he would ever say hello, goodbye, I love you, praying for them, because it was all gone in an instant. And Job reflects on this. Think of the words of Job. Job had to go to some sense of wisdom to make sense of, how do I make sense of losing everything I have, including my most precious valuables, my family, my children were taken away from me. And listen what Job says. Job had some time to reflect. We know Job was a man who asked God for wisdom because he worshiped God. He sought God. He asked for advice and instruction from him. And Job is a great source of wisdom for us. But notice if we turn to the book of Job, how did Job come to a place of wisdom in assessing the fact that how I wish I would have had one more day, one more year, in fact, many more years with my children. And it was gone in an instant. And Job reflects and says this in Job 14. This is what Job says in Job 14, verse 1. Man who is born of woman is short-lived and full of turmoil. Like a flower, he comes forth and withers. He also flees like a shadow and does not remain. I have no idea how old these children were. I know he'd had enough time to watch them grow up. He'd have enough time to watch them have houses and families of their own. And it says that they would enjoy spending time in each other's homes, having meals together. And I'm sure in his mind, he pretty much was looking forward to many more years of this. And as Job reflects even all the years he had with his children, he says it was over like that. Like that, it was gone. What do we do with that? That is a point of wisdom, that time is deceptive. It often is over much too soon. What we do is we redirect. We need to adjust our sails and the course of direction. It is a moment for us to take full, honest assessment of where our affections are, where the true, complete nature of our spirit and our love and our desires are, and ask ourselves, am I truly giving everything I have to waiting for that moment when all of my desires will be fulfilled in heaven? And if we're honest, certainly we these honest, innocent blessings that God gives to us, wants us to enjoy. It is deceptive at times because we think to ourselves how much time we have to engage in it. And since we do not have as much time as we think, since we really, it's a vapor that is here for a little while and vanishes away, we ought to redirect and set our sails on the affections on that house where that is eternal in the heavens. Consider a piece of wisdom that was actually found written in the Bible of Josh Kimberlin. He was the father that we had his picture up this morning with his family. And he was here, and now they're not, as many others are not. Well, he was a man who was striving to live in hope for a better existence, and they found his Bible, and he wrote something in his Bible. It seems very appropriate considering what happened. In his Bible, he wrote, "I cannot change the direction of the wind, but I can adjust my sails to always reach my destination." Some great piece of wisdom that he certainly had no concept of how much that would affect him. I cannot change the direction of the wind, but I can adjust my sails. Notice, I have no control. I have zero control of these calamities. No fortress we put for ourselves. No sense of fine-tuning or preservation can keep us from experiencing it. All the more reason to adjust our sails and set our affections on the one thing that can never be taken away, so long as we root ourselves there and are blessed with the one day to experience it. Turn to Mark chapter 4. This is exactly what Jesus was training his disciples to go through in Mark the 4th chapter. The fact that often when storms hit, there is often little we can do about it, and we cannot change the direction. Remember, the disciples were pleading to Jesus, "Do something about this." And here he is sleeping, his head on a cushion, while the boat is filling up, and they're literally scared to death, thinking this is the last time we're going to see each other. We're dying right here in this spot. And notice what Jesus says in Mark chapter 4, in verse 38. It says, Jesus himself was in the stern asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" What Jesus was asking them is, I want to know, are you ready finally to commit yourself in me? Are you ready finally to let everything be gone? Not only your previous fishing business, the families you've left behind. Are you willing to invest everything you have in the one constant, and that is Christ himself? And following him, devoting themselves to him, and recognizing that there is no controlling the outcome of certain disasters and pitfalls that we experience in this life, even with our relationship with Christ. He does not often shield us from these things. But if we walk by faith, we can have a certain confidence, we can have a contentment, a sense that if we truly are rooted and building our lives in him, then as Paul says, we can experience that beautiful place of contentment, whether I have an abundance or I lack. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Christ is the constant source of fulfillment and contentment, and he promises us and assures us if we build our lives on him, on that rock, he will pay out. It will be worth it. In fact, I love the question. Remember the question they cried out? I think another point of wisdom is crying out. Maybe it's appropriate to cry out at times. Sometimes I think we hold it in too much. Sometimes it's appropriate. Crying. The Psalms encourage us, cry out to God. He wants us to, because he has answers to give back to us. But they cried out, "Who is this? Who is this who even calms the storm, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" My favorite answer to that question is answered in John chapter 13. A question we might ask. Who is this who calls me to put redirect my sails and follow only him? Who is this who challenges me to let my affections and my desires rest in a temporary place and be willing to move forward and cling completely to the promises that he has? Who is this who assures us, and how can I have such confidence and hope in it? Listen to John chapter 13. Who is he? John chapter 13, beginning in verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God. There's only one person who truly has everything. That's why we're in this tug of war with this. We're like we want to have that sense of I want everything. I want it all. Well, there is one who has everything, Jesus. Everything had been given into his hands. And he had come from God, was going back to God. Who is this? Well, Jesus, who has everything, calls us to follow because he's going to make us fellow heirs, to be joint heirs with the one who the Father has given everything into his hands. He has access to all the eternal elements of glory and joy and assurances and blessing that are reigning in the heavenly places. This is why over and over again we're challenged. Look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are not seen. Look up towards the heavenly places where Christ is. Why? Because he has everything. Everything. Everything that's worthwhile. Anything of real value. Anything that's really, truly permanent, that truly satisfies. He has it. And guess what? He's willing to invite us to sit at his table where he wants to share these things with us and let us experience that. No wonder Jesus says, don't put your affections in this temporary world where people rob and steal and it breaks down and it's corrupted in matters of minutes, years. I have everything in my hand, everything that anyone would need. And it lasts, and many times even grows more and more dear and fonder to us the more we dig deeper and appreciate and understand what it is that he offers to us. So what a blessing, yes, that in times of loss where we can reflect, we can adjust our sails. When the winds howl and the storm shakes, we can ask ourselves, what direction are we headed? And if we need to adjust those sails, we can take wisdom from one who did that very thing. David had to adjust his sails, and he did it. He was one who was distracted by temptation. He went after things of this world, and he had a child with Bathsheba, and that child got sick. And he was very concerned about the sickness of that child, was fasting, praying, concerned. And that child died. And remember the story was the servants were very worried about David because he knew how worried he was when they knew the child was sick, and he thought, when he finds out the child has died, what's going to happen to him? Can he go on? And he actually was surprised that he'd washed his face and he began eating. And well, I don't understand. Think of the piece of wisdom David shares with us. He says, now he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him. He readjusted his sails to say, I will go to the place with eternal rest. I will go to the place where those who have comfort and security in Christ, where they reside free of pain, free of all these things that we're going through in this temporary life. He said, I'm done living for these things. I'm going to him. And he rededicated his life, his self. Repented. Perhaps that's where we need to be at times as well. And we can. The Lord encourages us and asks us to do that very thing, change our direction. And another last point of wisdom I think we can take from that is if we do adjust our sails, we can take great comfort to know we will never be at home until we're with Jesus. We will always be wandering from one thing to the next, from one temporary sense of zenith and high and exhilaration to trying to go another place because those things have expiration dates on them. And so we wander and we go from sadness to healing, to more sadness, to more healing, to trying to get those pains out of our minds and bringing our affections to the things that temporarily may give us some sense of joy, only to find out that those things don't last either. John chapter 14, verses 3 through 4, Jesus said, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going. Essentially what Jesus said was, I'm preparing a home for you. That's why, again, he wants us to adjust our sails and put it all in him. Because in those hands that God has given all things, he is the perfect carpenter. Since he was that physical carpenter here on earth, he is the spiritual builder of a church, a kingdom, a place where there is no end. And he, the perfect one who has orchestrated and allowed these things to come into existence, invites us to follow him, to put our life in his hands, that we might be where he is. And again, we encourage anyone who's with us who perhaps needs to come to some points of wisdom, maybe in your own life, where you're feeling that sense of loss or that sense of pain, or the temporary things that you've put your trust in seem to be fleeting and getting further and further away from you. This is a great time to readjust, to realign your life. And something else I love about that passage in James, just one final thought, and we'll end our lesson on this note. I love the merciful compassion of God who asks us to come to him. You know, oftentimes it's hard for us to admit we're wrong, or hard to admit we are wrong and need to change. And maybe we're fearing going and having to admit that to somebody. And maybe fear they're going to have some sense of, almost saying, well, what did you expect? What did you think was going to happen? Kind of make us feel a little bit more of a sting when we're already kind of stinging itself, knowing, well, I know I've got to change, and I know I've done wrong, and I know I haven't had the best amount of confidence in these things. I need to learn better. But I love what he says here about when we come to God, when we turn around, when we realize we need to be taught, and we need to be led, and we need to be redirected in life. I love what he says in verse 5. James 1:5 says, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously without reproach. That is, he doesn't look at us and say, oh, it's about time you turned around and looked at me. He doesn't do that. Instead, he is so eager and so happy and so pleased that you are turning to him. He says he has great desire to give you this wisdom. He doesn't upbraid you over it. He doesn't criticize you over it. He says, I'm so thankful you trust me now. Yes, I've got wisdom for you, and this is going to be so much better for you, and will help you truly have confidence as you change your steps and go in another direction. For anyone who needs that wisdom, take that confidence that God is not going to upbraid you over your confession and your recognition that you need to turn around. He's loving, he's patient, he's merciful, and he has mercy and grace for you if you need to come to him. If anyone who's never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, again, he certainly does not upbraid us as we come to be baptized. He is so overwhelmed. It says there's rejoicing with the angels in heaven over any sinner who repents, especially when one who recognizes the need to be baptized for forgiveness of sins, and there's going to be rejoicing coming out of those waters, recognizing you're giving your life to the one who has all things in his hands. And anyone who's fallen away, anyone who's slipped back into the affection of this world, if you need to turn around, redirect your sails, God is anxiously ready to be with you and help you and strengthen you and guide you the rest of the way home. Whatever your need is, won't you come and let's assist you and help you be right with God while we stand and sing this psalm encouragement together.